In fact, it has to be claimed as the domain in which we work and the domain that connects different strands of the kind of work we do. Now, let's go back to the full picture, as it were, and how we are going to, how am I going to make a case in terms of illustrating how rights connect the strands. Now, if you go back to the earlier panel, for example, let me just take one in a sort of improvising style. A couple of the books that were discussed on identities, but not necessarily about either governance or citizenship. Then the question is, well, when is that particular study actually touches on citizenship? I want to be able to sort of articulate that. Let's take, for example, youth bereavement. That, of course, is a significant question of identity and a significant social issue in the domain that it actually delineates. And in that domain, there are a variety of studies, including the study that was done here at CCIG that we talked about earlier, that does not necessarily speak to governance and citizenship. But one word, I think, one word that was mentioned with respect to the youth bereavement question is that it places new demands on institutions. That means, at a first step, this translation from the question of identities into citizenship involves a first stage translation of articulation of a demand, a claim that can be made upon public services, public resources. But then at a second stage, what would happen, what we would need to look at, does it also produce, now going to the constituents of citizenship, does it produce also subjects of citizenship? In other words, subjects who will constitute themselves as claimants, as rights bearers on those services. Now we're talking about translation. Now we're talking about how a study in youth bereavement can actually translate itself into, by asking several other questions in terms of whether they are subjects who are making claims, whether there are demands and particular claims being made on public services. When these questions are asked and the answers are yes, then we are actually moving into the domain of citizenship. And the moment that we move into the domain of citizenship, governance issue comes in. I would say automatically comes in. Because there's no way of deliberating on the question of whether certain rights claims should be translated into rights that should be legalized without conduct of conduct. That is, how are we going to enact the rights claimant subjects into citizens so that this can be written into the law? You see the cycle that I'm drawing. This is, to me, fundamentally important. Going back to the issue of where do we draw the line? Well, yes, we can talk about all sorts of different citizenships, but then I would place it as a demand how this translation or articulation is done. Another example is transgender citizenship, or the questions of identity about transgendered people. Now, that does not necessarily have to address issues of governance or citizenship inherently. There could be studies about the very complicated and complicating ways in which transgender people constitute themselves as neither nor ways, and so on. And these complex studies exist. But when we do talk about medicalization of transgender identity, and whether NHS should pay or not for, let's say, a particular surgery associated with it, or even whether should NHS pay for counseling services for transgender people, then we are in the domain of governance and citizenship. That is being translated from identities. But because we are moving into the domain and beginning to think about whether certain rights should be articulated, those rights should be legalized, and so on, that doesn't mean that identity domain or the strand and the governance domain cease to operate. Still, the complexity of the situation is that can we actually think in political legal terms about citizenship rights that take into complex operations of identity into account? So that means the work that gets done in identities, the works that gets done in governance is absolutely essential. But what is really significant is to be able to ask that question. Let me give you one more example. How am I doing with time? Should I wrap? Yeah. Okay, I will wrap up. Should I give one more example? Yes. All right. Let's take actually Jeff's book on security. He articulated very nicely security as a control, a method of governing, let's say, populations. It's a method of governing and creating a space in the way in which it articulates itself, security, not by negative terms, if I understand him correctly, but enacting actually positive encouragement by creating a space of what it calls freedom. So then there are spillover effects of having created a space in which security should hold, then who doesn't belong, who does, and so on come into play. Now there, interesting thing is, of course, mobility simultaneously is freedom, but also can be interpreted as a right. In other words, certain subjects are constituted as claimants of mobility, and hence given the right to do so, and certain subjects are reduced into status of abjects for absolutely not having that particular right. So insecurity and security, of course, can be studied in its own terms as a question of government. But for me, it's not a long way to be able to translate back into the question of citizenship and the articulation of rights. But only if we use citizenship in this limited and delimiting sense, that it involves the constitution of rights and responsibilities simultaneously. And without making that move, I'm afraid I find much of the time citizenship then used as a term, an adjective that sounds constitutive and significant, but actually it does not have the persuasive, delimited, analytical rigor associated with it. And that would be a cause for concern. I will stop right there. Thanks very much for your patience.
Well, thank you, Engin. I think we chose the right person to be director of this centre that consists of those three things, because you bring them together beautifully. We already said at the break, Engin and I, that we need 3 hours to tease out any of these things, just one panel, let alone the whole three together. So I understand that we don't have a great deal of time to do it now. Sorry, stand in front of the microphone. So a few questions, and I think we've just got 10 minutes worth. Graham.
Yes, I'm Graham Thompson from Politics, and thank you for mentioning me. What I wanted to do, I think, is a terrifically eloquent defence of rights being the sort of linking kind of concept between the three domains and so on. But it seems to me that it's possible to, as it were, kind of have a parallel one that links them, one that is a slightly more uncomfortable one, but that is order or orders, if you see what I mean. So it's not just rights, there are also order. There's also order and orders. And I think you could construct a kind of story that would use order to do more or less the kind of things that you say that rights does, in a way, but perhaps with some less kind of comfortable sort of outcomes. And